a bit of knowledge along the way. And really, what Neville said there, I started my career in the West Highlands up in Fort William and Oban. And if anybody knows that part of the world, it's a tough old place to grow trees. It's extremely wet. It rains 300 days of the year, and you've got upland conditions down to sea level. So I started my career in 1990, early 1990s down there, and very much looking after young plantations between 5 and 15 years of age. And my work really involved sorting out drainage problems and a lot of fertilization, both which are key parts of ground preparation and cultivation. Another thing that was happening in the early 90s is there's a change away from large-scale productive woodland creation and a move to large-scale new native woodlands. And I spent a lot of time putting up fences and planting native woodlands in those first few years.
I'm so fed up with these.
Dave, you're on mute.
Okay, sorry, folks. I don't know how much you missed that. What I was saying really is that after about 1993, the large-scale commercial afforestation disappeared. It's only recently, in the last 5-6 years, that it's risen up the sort of government's priorities across Scotland, England, Wales, and the devolved administrations, and we're now looking to plant a lot more trees again. And it's interesting that my career has also changed, that I'm now planting a lot of woodlands in the north of England and the Scottish borders. And I've moved down the hill. We're finding we're actually planting better land. And when I worked in the West Highlands, it was very much about ploughing and draining and fertilizing. Today, we're moving down the hill. The sites are getting better. And the issues and challenges are also changing. So we're seeing that we're swapping the sort of issues of moving water off sites to being able to handle vegetation and use good weed control to get things established. So it's a changing world, and it's going to change more in the next few years because it is a major priority of the government now to establish more woodlands. So, but I think the fundamentals of ground preparation haven't really changed. I think I've said if you go onto the Cumbria Woodlands website, I said that we're at risk of making it too complicated. I think anybody who's tried to grow potatoes in their back garden will understand the basics of cultivation. Basically, keep the soil warm, dry, aerated, and and manage your water. And so it is for trees. So it's a pretty simple thing at heart. But we do need to get it right. We need to understand the sort of challenges, and we need to get it right for a number of reasons. Firstly, because as you're a private forester practitioner like myself, we don't want to get prosecuted. And poor ground preparation is a very good way to find yourselves up in court, because there is a great risk of creating siltation and pollution from poor ground preparation. So we have to be aware of that. I work in the borders. Nearly every stream that flows down from a hill in the borders feeds into the River Tweed. It's a treble SI, it's an SAC. You've got to get these things right. We also need to get things right because, again, for a private sector forester, I'm working for a client. I'm giving them a budget. I'm telling them how to establish that site within, using the grants and do it cost effectively. If I get it wrong, it's going to cost the client money, and it means they're not going to pay my wages. And I might even be sued. So we must take this seriously. We've got to plan for it. We've got to understand our sites, we've got to understand our locations, and come up with a good plan. Now, we also need to look at various other issues as well, and such as archaeology is a key part of this. So as part of when you're planning woodlands, you're looking at all the constraints. And archaeological features, again, are rising up the sort of level of prominence and consideration when carrying out ground preparation. You're looking at dikes, settlements, and things like rig and furrow, which can be quite extensive. And again, so trying to use minimal ground preparation techniques on those sites might be a key part of what you're trying to achieve. Water quality also is a major consideration. And again, it probably is the most important consideration for all ground preparation. So what I would like to say is that this course and the presentations that Cumbria Woodlands have put together, very good detail on there. You're going to be guided to some additional reading. I would say that the presentations very much follow good and current practice, and there's a new guidance note out from the Forestry Commission England. And that's is very much covered in the sort of slides and presentations. I will say from the outset that as a practitioner, I will have probably sign up for 90% of that. There are 1 or 2 points within the new guidance that I think practitioners, particularly those working in upland scenarios, would maybe query. And a couple of things I'll highlight from the outset is the sort of interpretation of what ploughing is and when ploughing is needed. And also there's a sort of mantra that we should try to avoid disturbing or changing soils. Now, I think when we're establishing new native woodlands, I think that's a very good fundamental principle. But I think we have to realize if we are trying to grow a crop of trees and a crop of timber, we want to do that as best we can. Maximizing yield, maximizing growth is a fundamental part of good forestry. And I don't think we should shy away from that. And we should realize that we will be changing soils, like it or not. And it's interesting, I was looking at some of the figures about carbon levels in soils. And I know that typical arable soils in improved pasture have less than 70 tons per hectare of carbon. However, by the end of a first rotation, the carbon within soils can be above 360. We are putting roots, we're putting fiber, we're putting carbon into soils. We should be proud of that as foresters. That's fixing carbon in our soils. We're changing the soils. So I don't think we should shy away from, certainly when we're growing timber crops, to realize that we are going to change those soils. And I think we're changing them for the better. Okay, and I also think, again, that we need to recognize that with this new wave of tree planting, which the government is pushing forward, there is a move to bring tree planting down the hill. That's happening because timber prices are at record levels. They are now valuable investments, and we can actually plant better ground. That also minimizes the risk of and conflict of planting what traditional hill ground, where forestry really through the 70s and 80s was planted. But it brings about new changes, where again, on that hill ground, you'll probably be fighting against poor soils, poor nutrition, poor drainage. We're moving on to better soils, and we're going to have to think about how we minimize weed problems as well. So they're the sort of things we're going to cover in the presentations. I think that's probably as much as I would say as an introduction, and I think we can probably just move forward and look at some of those presentations. I hope you have them available to look through as we go through. But if we start with module 1, I think that's a good point to pick up. I can just ask Neville if everything is looking okay with the presentations and if we should move forward.
Yeah, happy to do that. So if I can ask Claire to share the questions, they should now be in Mentimeter. If we all log back into Mentimeter, open that up in front of you, you should be able to see the questions that have been pre-submitted from those that have done the homework, and then others will be able to add additional questions. So you will be able to see these on the shared screen. If you can't see Mentimeter and you're struggling to access that, then please add questions into the chat, and then we will add those into Mentimeter for you so that everybody else can see them. Okay, so questions that we have or areas for discussion are up in front of you now. Dave, perhaps you'd just like to go through those, and really happy for people to expand on that if they want to come back to Dave as well with further questions and discussions.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll just take some of those questions in turn. And we'll start on the left there. So we've been asked about the potential impact of ground preparation works on natural flood management issues needed, as many woodlands are now being planted for natural flood management benefits. I think that's true. I'm not sure how many woodlands are being planted for natural flood management. Certainly some will be. My experience is that most clients, certainly in the private sector, planting woodlands are planting woodlands because they see it as an investment, or they want to have a sort of personal interest in biodiversity and investment. But the issue of ground cultivation needs to be considered closely in any catchment where there is a risk of flooding. In fact, any catchment where there's a risk of acidification. or any sensitive sensitive water catchments, because poorly planned ground cultivation, poorly planned drainage really has considerable potential to cause erosion and to release silt and mud into watercourses. Whether or not that would have a direct impact on floods will depend on the size of any particular project. It's probably unlikely that the project would be big enough to have a direct impact there. But it's certainly the case that poorly designed drainage systems and poorly designed ploughing can cause flooding with neighbours' lands and neighbours' properties, and you'll soon know about that if you get that wrong. So the risk, I see siltation and pollution as being the biggest hurdle that you need to consider when planning any cultivation. So we need to be careful there. And it has to be recognised, if you are using more intensive cultivation methods, particularly ploughing is very effective at shifting surface water. That's what it's designed to do. And if that's shifted straight into drains, which link into other drains, then you're going to be moving water very quickly off the site. So it needs a great deal of thought in those scenarios.
Okay, so before we move away from that, I wonder whether the person that raised that question wants to come back on that, or whether anybody else does on that specific topic. Please either raise your hand electronically using the reactions button, or switch your camera on, wave your arms, or put something in the chat and we'll try and pick it up. So Phil, did you want to come in?
I was looking for the wavy button. I found it in the end, sorry. Yeah, I mean, the only thing I disagree with is that certainly over in Yorkshire here, a lot of the new woodland schemes are going in for natural flood management benefit. We're running a big project up on the Upper Air catchment, and since the floods in Leeds in, how many years ago was it, 5, 6, 7 years ago, there's been a lot of emphasis on an NFM further up the catchment to try and reduce peak flood flow. So we've probably put in something like 90 hectares in lots of relatively small, 1 hectare up to 10, 15 hectare blocks of woodland over the last few years. So that's the only thing I'd comment on, really.
No, it's good to hear that more's going in for natural flood management. And when the new Forestry Commission grants are launched in May, there is, May, June time, there is going to be a significant uplift for natural flood management if it meets the right criteria. So no, point well.
Excellent. Well, it all started with the Woodland for Water scheme, which was that in 2013, 14, I think it started. Forestry Commission incentive. I don't know whether that operated in Cumbria, but it certainly operated over in Yorkshire and Humber here.
Cool. Excellent. Thanks ever so much, Phil. Shall we move on to the next one? Discussion of topsoil inversion for new woodland establishment on further agricultural land.
Mm-hmm. This might go as no surprise for somebody that started their career in the West Highlands and is working in sort of Northumberland and the Scottish borders, that I don't have any direct experience of this. But it is a well-known technique, particularly on improved ground and ex-arable ground, and particularly relevant for establishing native woodlands, where you actually have a complete cultivation of the site and deep plough and invert the sort of fertile topsoil and push that down into the soil profile, and it actually reduces the fertility of the site. And that's going to be very good for minimizing weed on what would otherwise be a very fertile site. But you can also get sort of semi-natural vegetation established in there. So that's one of the reasons. But I reading around, I can see that some practitioners in lowland Britain are using that for more productive woodlands again, and perhaps not doing the inversion so deep, but it just reducing that fertility on what would otherwise be a site, which arable sites, which could be very weed prone and need a lot of herbicides. So yes, it's good innovation and a different technique, and one that again I've not seen in sort of written guidance. So I think it's a good point to raise, and on the right sites, it is the right thing to do. Interestingly, if you're reading the guidance, this could possibly be the most intensive form of cultivation, and the guidance suggests we should reduce that. But I think you'd have to be looking at, you're only going to be doing this on the sites which we're going to be very free draining, probably without low rainfall areas. And probably the cultivation is akin to what's gone before with with ploughing and seeding of that sort of ground. So yeah, a useful thing and a good point to raise in terms of a more innovative and unusual sort of ground preparation technique.
And equally, I'll hand back to the person that raised the question if they want to take that further. So please make yourself known. Is that you again, Phil? Before I do, what I would do is I'd point to session 3 and 4. So session 3 and 4 are actually going to be looking at ground preparation techniques. So perhaps considering that more fully then, you know, this session is all about what is ground preparation, site conditions and tree growth. So the actual techniques we'll be coming to in later sessions. Phil, was that a question?
Yeah, I promise I won't comment. Of course, I think I probably put in most of the questions. Sorry, apologies for that. So I won't comment on them all. But I first came across topsoil inversion on a forestry Leonardo da Vinci study tour in Denmark, where they've used it quite widely a long time, you know, quite a lot of years really, for shelter belt establishment. And it just struck me as a really innovative and potentially very effective system, really. So you're burying the topsoil under a thin layer of subsoil, you reduce your weed burden, you reduce the competition, moisture competition, vegetation competition with tree roots, and the roots are also, you know, right there in a good deep layer of topsoil. And the infertile top also means it's a really good medium for establishing wildflowers in. So it just, but it only, as the speaker was saying, it only really applies on recently cultivated sites, I think.
Okay. Anybody else want to expand on that point? If you do, raise your hand, because we are trying to get that kind of tutorial feel to it. It's quite hard when you've got 100 people in an electronic room, but let's give it a go anyway. So does anybody else wish to come in on that? Either raise your hand or speak up or put something in the chat. Okay, we'll move on then. And I'm going to move on to maybe the question on the top right-hand corner, maybe more discussion on suiting the species to the site to avoid need for ground prep. Not sure if replanting on heather still sites still appropriate. See slide 11, module 2.
Well, it's a fundamental of all forestry and silviculture that you're going to try to match species to site. And it's probably most appropriate when you're creating a new native woodland. I think that you're trying to get a range of species to match a particular NVC type, and they may vary considerably across the site. You know, you could have half a dozen different NVC types and species mixed across the site. And that choice is related to the soil and site conditions. And again, where you are in the country. But I think what I have to say is that while that is absolutely vital and important, I don't think it mitigates the need to consider ground preparation. And I am of the view that I think there should be a presumption. You should presume that you're probably going to be using some form of ground preparation, be that cultivation or be that sort of weed control for most sites. It's very unusual if you're going to find a site which you can just direct plant and not have to worry about. So yes, you've got to match your species to your site, but it's really going to be very rare that you're going to get away without some form of ground preparation, some sort of cultivation. So I think that is absolutely essential. The same is true for when you're matching timber species. I am tempted to say that the answer when you're planting timber is Sitka spruce, in which case, you know, centuries of silviculture might go out the window. But again, if you're going to try to plant Scots pine, Douglas fir, other species that you're going to be looking at, you're going to have to think about your site and what the requirements are. Generally, you know, Sitka is going to be on the poorer sites. The other conifers are going to be a bit more demanding. So, and you know, you're going to be on better sites and have different issues to think about. So that's the case. Quick point on heather. Yes, it's probably these days most heather is going to be part of heathland and might be priority species. So unlikely to be planting timber crops, non-native species on heather in England, certainly in England, not so in Scotland. But I would say you can still plant native woodland. Planting native woodland on heaths and on some areas of heather and heath is still a viable thing to do.
Okay. Some discussion on hand screefing on basic minimum would be helpful. What do you reckon? Sounds like hard work to me, but very appropriate for some sites.
I think it is hard. It is hard. I think by that, I think that, again, it'd be interesting to see if we put a question there, but it's this practice of taking, when you're direct planting on a site, probably almost certainly going to be native woodland or broadleaves, that a planter will just slice off the sort of top vegetation, usually grass over that with the spade. I don't think you could really call that ground preparation, and it certainly doesn't. While it's useful for maybe settling down a tube or something, it doesn't provide any meaningful long-term weed control. Hand screefing is not going to stop you from needing to do sort of vegetation control. So yeah, good practice. And interestingly, again, when I first started in forestry, there was still a few people actually doing some hand turfing. Now that really was hard work, whereby you dig a drain, cut out the turfs, and then lay them out and plant them out. Now that really was torture. I would be amazed if anybody's still doing that, but good luck if you are. Good way to get fit.
Cool. Phil, did you want to come in there? You added something to the chat.
Yeah, sorry, thanks. Yeah, I just make the point that if you get the impression, don't you, that most of my schemes are new native woodland schemes and relatively small, but I've become increasingly aware over the years that this small area of hand screefing when you plant and stick the tube on, because most of my schemes are Tubex type tubes, put the tube over the plant, it's absolutely crucial that you don't have a load of grass inside that tube, because all you end up with is a great mass of grass growing up in the tube and smothering the plant. So that when I'm talking about hand screefing, I'm literally meaning skimming off a little sod that you plant the plant into before you put the tube over it. That may or may not be cultivation, probably isn't.
Oh, thank you. So we'll move on to the carbon question next. Was that from you as well, Phil?
Sorry, no, that one wasn't. For a change.
I'll ask the person who set the carbon question to restate that a little bit. So it's, are you putting carbon in the long term at time of clear fell? Won't significant amounts of carbon be lost, especially as soil biology dies? Now, Mark, I see you've unmuted yourself. Do you want to talk to that briefly, just to expand on that question?
Yeah, as Dave was saying, that basically we're locking down a lot of carbon in the soil at the point of, well, forest plantings and stuff like that. But I'd have a bit of an issue if we're still on clear fell rather than continuous cover forestry. In fact, that dramatic change does a significant amount of damage, and you will lose a lot of that soil carbon. So the main carbon count is the timber that's being converted and used for building, construction, whatever. That's the real lockdown. In terms of soil biology and stuff, I still feel we're on quite an aggressive approach as far as I can see.
Okay, just before you answer that, Dave, I'm just going to tee up Carrie to come in to touch on that, because we've just done a piece of work on that. So I'll go to Dave and then Carrie, if that's okay. So good question, Mark. I'll hand over to Dave and then to Carrie.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I was asked to do this by Neville, I thought, and I read the guidance, and a key element of the guidance is, the new guidance is about minimizing carbon loss through cultivation. And I thought, well, yes, now I better do some reading on that. And I think we're going to point you in the direction of a couple of good summaries commissioned by the Forestry Commission England, Forestry Commission Scotland, with support from the Forest Research and the Hutton Institute. And I think the summaries are quite instructive, and I think everybody really needs to read these, because the evidence for carbon loss from from planting woodlands, well, I can't see it. What we see, and again, some figures here from one of those studies, and this is Robert Matthews from Forest Research, that the total carbon per hectare after first rotation in forest soils on deep peats is 539 tons of carbon per hectare, compared to the starting level of 85, and that's about the top 1 meter, because we're assuming nothing happens under there. Wherever you look, carbon significantly increases from what research is there. I'm not saying the research is infallible, and it's probably a growing area of research. But when I read into it, I see that forests in nearly all situations, even with clear felling, a rapidly increasing carbon in the soils. It's recognised again. If you look at the woodland carbon calculators, it's clear that rotations, the first rotation of a forest crop fixes something about 300 tons of carbon to the hectare, whereas a rotation of native woodland growing well over 60, 70 years might be double that because it's not being disturbed. But all those things are taken into consideration. I think there's been a lot of the RSPB and organising us that have tried to discredit forestry in terms of its the impact of reducing soil carbon. But everywhere I look, I see that figures suggest that there's an increase in soil carbon. Again, another figure that you might want to make note of is that the loss of carbon per year from planting deep peat, something we don't do now, but something we did, was thought to be about 2.4 tons of carbon per hectare per year. But we're still getting gains of probably 6 to 8 tons per hectare per year in terms of just timber on those sites. So even on deep peat, which is again, we're not doing that. Nobody's going to be doing that anymore. There's a positive case for carbon. There's not a positive case for the environment and biodiversity, but a positive case for carbon. So I think that we want to leave you to go and do that reading and read these summaries. And I think it raises some questions about that the guidance perhaps doesn't follow the science in that particular case.
I had the most amazing lecturer in California. All the Californians hated him, and I thought he was a visionary. He stood at the front of the class and went, "Is that the right answer? I don't know." And essentially he was saying, it's complex. Think about it, read about it, make up your own mind, engage in the discussion. And I think that's what we're doing today. It's really starting to turn into a tutorial now, which is good. Carrie, do you want to come in on that? We've just done a piece of work.
I can.
Trust on this.
Yeah, I mean, I can follow on a little bit. Dave's gone into a lot of detail there, and it is really about how complicated at the moment the research is, just because it's so nuanced in different regions, different areas, different soil types. But the general idea that carbon is locked up in the organic matter of the soil. So the less organic matter you have, the less carbon you have in the soil. You have organic soils and you have mineral soils, and this is why we talk about them in different ways. So the mineral soils, you're not releasing much carbon when you are, the research shows, you're not releasing that much carbon when you're actually using any ground prep on there, because there's a lot less of the organic matter. The higher the organic matter, the more carbon there is, and the more likely you are to lose carbon in the process. And there is a balance here. So you can recover that carbon within a year or two on some sites. So as soon as that tree goes in, it starts to store carbon back into the soil again. And over several years, you can then go into positive carbon storage. So you're actually adding more carbon into the soil. So under a forest, the soils account for approximately 60% of carbon in the whole forest area. And so there's a lot locked up inside there. And what we want to do is, of this, I would suggest you want to have minimal disturbance of the soils where possible. Therefore, you have less carbon to have to put back into the soil afterwards, because there'll always be a tiny bit of soil loss. Even removing the grass from the top of the soil, we'll lose a little bit of carbon over that time. That grass is not putting carbon into the soil. So there is a lot of, as I said, it's incredibly nuanced, incredibly detailed. There is a lot of research going on at the moment, and modelling studies through forest research and others, which is incredibly interesting. And the information that comes out is a cautious one. So it's a cautious approach from the Forestry Commission. Let's take it and make sure that we're not removing too much or adding too much carbon back into the atmosphere as possible as we move forward. And I hope that kind of just helps to generalize the scene.
Okay, I'll come back to Mark to come back on that, and then we'll move on to another question, I think. So Mark?
Yeah, I was just posted a couple of things in there. So I'm coming from the soil food web background, which was USA based. And yeah, we see that old growth forest is phenomenal in terms of fungal side, but this is about undisturbed long-term ancient woodland. I mean, the whole issue of compaction at harvesting, basically turning the soil anaerobic, these sorts of things. There's a lot of challenges about, are we actually measuring realistically what's happening to soil biology? Most of the critters, the fungi, the bacteria, they rely on plant exudates. In the standard Sitka plantation, you don't get a lot of undergrowth. So when you fell your timber, you're no longer getting those plant exudates to feed the soil with food web. So that's why I'd suggest that the carbon count in the soil can actually move on. I'm interested in what Carrie's saying. I'd love to have a chat with her, because I think, you know, that it is a very young science still, and we just need to be looking at how we're realistically measuring what's going on in the soils.
We're writing a proposal at the moment for future events and pieces of work like this, and one of the items that we've included in that is carbon, and I think you've underlined the need and the kind of demand for engagement and stuff on that. So really important questions. Thank you. Anybody else want to come in before I move on? I just don't want to get lost entirely on the carbon debate, because I think we could spend the next 2 hours doing that. Okay, so can we come to the question in the bottom right hand of the Menti screen, which is, as many foresters are saying, drought conditions are likely to become more common as the climate changes. Can anything be done at the ground prep stage to alleviate potential future drought conditions?
It's a good question, and I think as forestry comes down the hill and goes into lowland areas, then the issues of drought become more significant. And it's certainly something in my day-to-day work over the last 3 years in particular, that the springs have been incredibly dry, and we have had significant losses. And it's interesting that the losses have been mainly in softer conifer species like Scots pine and Douglas fir. Bizarrely, good old Sitka spruce, as tough as old boots, seems to be untouched. But again, we do need to think about cultivation. And I think there is a tendency in cultivation is to just jump for the latest tool, which is the EnviroMounder, which produces a nice shallow mound. And it's easy to see, the planters like it. But the thing about these things, they dry out very quickly. So EnviroMounders on dry sites, on well-drained fertile brown earths, can be quite problematic. And interestingly, the EnviroMounder actually is almost a scarifier. And on those sites, you might actually be better off popping the tree into the hole that's been created rather than popping it on the mound. So the same tool can act as a scarifier. So we need to be careful. And we do need, the question is, maybe would we be better on those particular good sites, well-drained sites, low rainfall areas, would we be better just doing direct planting, or perhaps doing a little bit of ripping and weak herbicide control rather than doing cultivation? It is a fundamental question to ask, and it is absolutely essential that we think about that.
Cool.
And maybe just to throw in another point again, we ended up with some of our sites last year, which we planted in January and between January and March, and we had massive losses with the drought. We ended up planting cell-grown Douglas fir in July and August, and they're looking all right. So we perhaps do need to think outside of the box. We perhaps need to think and be using cold store plants, and recognizing that rainfall patterns our summers seem to be actually quite high in rainfall, whereas our springs seem to be dry. So we do have to think hard, and maybe just move away from what we've always done.
Okay, excellent. The person that set that question, do you want to come in at this point? Please unmute yourself, maybe, and if you have anything to add.
I can't find the raise hand button, so I'll just start talking.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I think you covered that quite well, Dave. I suppose it was the kind of, it's a bigger question. We're planting forests for the next 30 years rather than right now. And is there I noticed reading through this the module texts, there's a lot about lowering the water table and this sort of thing. And I thought, has there been any occasions yet where you would lower the water table as the conditions are now, but you're worried that if you're in a drought prone area, and again, and if these forecasts come true in 10 years, it's more drought prone, would you actually not now attempt to lower the water table? If that makes sense.
I think it's a good point. And I think climate, we're still getting to grips to know what the climate change is, and its rainfall patterns are different, because actually what we're seeing is probably heavier rainfall in the winter, which can cause waterlogging. We seem to be seeing dry springs, and yet we seem to be probably seeing slightly heavier rainfall in the summer with sort of cloudbursts and things like that. So we need to be very careful. I think we generally on well-drained soils, there is absolutely, you shouldn't be looking to lower the water table, which ploughing does do, and which, ploughing is pretty effective at moving water away from a site, and it does change the site, and it can change the site for a whole rotation just ploughing. Again, some of the guidance suggests that that the ground preparation is temporary and really only lasts for 2 years. Well, you only have to walk through, stands which are 40 years have been ploughed. You can see the plough footage is still working. So, but the last thing you want to do is do that on a dry site. So it is about understanding your sites, understanding what the issues are, and coming up with the best solution. So it does need careful thought.
Has that covered off your query, David? And if so, can you give Dave Atkinson a ranking out of 10 for his answer for that?
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay.
Solid 7, Dave. Room for improvement.
Thank you, David.
No worries.
Excellent. So there's a question about mycorrhiza, which is one up on the left, and I can't quite see the top of it. Given the push for traditional ground prep techniques such as cultivation and herbicide, is there any role for considering introduction of mycorrhizal fungi as a ground prep technique and greater use of wood chip mulch in establishment? I don't know who raised that question. Do you want to build on that before, just to give Dave a little bit of time to think about that? Anybody want to come in on that? Just unmute yourself and talk if you are out there.
Yeah, hi, that was me. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry, who are you?
Simon Masgray.
Great, thank you, Simon.
Yeah, it's possibly slightly kind of left field question. I mean, there's a lot of people talking these days about the importance of mycorrhizal fungi to trees, and that they need them to establish and to feed. And one way of doing that might be to use wood chip mulch on the site, which would again have the advantage potentially of reducing weed competition if we're wanting to move away from using glyphosates where possible. So I just thought I'd throw that idea in. Possibly, of course, applying it on any scale might be the issue, but possibly more relevant to smaller scale plantings and plantings where wood chip can be easily brought in. I don't know if it's something that's on mainstream forestry research or not.
Yeah, there was an excellent presentation at the Institute of Chartered Foresters series in the autumn by somebody from, is it James Hutton, just outside Aberdeen? And they did some excellent work on mycorrhiza, which really got you thinking. Anyway, Dave.
Again, I'm no expert on this, but I am aware that some nurseries are looking at inoculating their stock with mycorrhiza to aid their establishment. So I think that can only be positive. Again, I can't see that would again mitigate good choices between ground, with good cultivation, ground preparation, and weed control. I think they go hand in hand. But I think it's something which can probably help, establishment, help growth, and that's all a good thing. The other part of it is mulches, and again, I am aware that some practitioners, certainly south of the country, have been using mulches for some time, and I think there are examples. There might be Falcon Forestry. We're working with local authorities who had a dearth of green waste, and they were actually spreading mulches. With a tractor mounted equipment and laying lines of mulches and then planting through them, and that's wonderful. Again, it's the availability of these things. You've got to be able to get this material at low cost because it's a heavy material. If you're having to import that, and it's and these days there's people want this green material, mulches for garden material. So it comes down to cost and practicality. Yeah, absolutely. I can't, for some sites and small sites, I can see it being really useful. For people who want to use a more organic approach, then it certainly works. Whether or not it'll be mainstream forestry, I'm not sure, but it certainly has a role to play. And it's, it's all part of that mix of innovation and looking for different practices.
Okay. I'll come to Neil Kenny next, who wanted to comment on the summertime planting. And then back to Mark, who wanted to talk a little bit about mycorrhiza. So Neil first, and then...
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, hear you loud and clear.
Yeah. Hi, yeah. We're a specialist Japanese maple grower, Japanese maples, and we, for a long time, past 30 years, we've had problems in the spring with Japanese maples and potting on and things like that. But we found that if you plant and if you pot in August, you get a lot of root production, and they've done everything. It's almost like a tree is in the spring. It's got a lot to do. It's got to grow. It's got to make root. It's got so much to do, and it can stretch it out. Whereas when you get to August or July, it's done most of its growing. It settles down, and then all it's got to do really is, well, we can make root. And I think it is, as you say, thinking outside the box on things. I think we've always been led by the nurseryman having to lift stuff in October, wants to get it out in the marketplace, plant it in autumn, and there's a lot of stuff from our side of it. It's containerized now, so you can plant sort of when you want. So I'm a big supporter of, and I've had a lot of success with sort of late July, August planting, because they've got time to make root before the winter comes. And as you say, you're probably going to have a lot of thunderstorms in July, August, and rain. So that was, I was glad to hear. I think that's a comment on that.
Useful reflection. Thank you, Neil. I'll come on to Mark, who's put a question in the chat about chemical weed control.
Yeah, I like Neil's point there, actually, because our season's getting pushed back and back in terms of planting. So if we can look at other options on planting, because it's so dry, and we're committing trees to the ground and then they're going into a really dry spring. So that was great. But my message on mycorrhizal is basically, I've been looking at soil biology as a whole, and every time we do weed control, if it's chemical based, that's actually going to work about the soil biology that we're installing. Our aim is to get the fungal levels up as high as possible, and we're looking at inoculants and extracts to do that. And basically it defeats the purpose. So I would really be quite concerned if they were trying to offer a chemical weed control process at the same time as mycorrhizal. It will basically counteract each other and cut it out.
Dave, do you want to answer that, or should we? There is another question in the chat about.
No, I think, well, it's new. It's not really mainstream forestry yet. The reality is that we're going to be looking to plant 10,000 hectares of forestry very soon. And, we will be reliant on traditional practices to do that, certainly in the foreseeable future. But, any innovations are going to be welcome. Nurseries are working hard to do that. And, I think we've got to be open-minded about how we go ahead.
Yeah, cool. So in the bottom left of Mentimeter is a question. One further thought: sounds like glyphosate might be withdrawn in the next few years. What do we do about spot weeding on fertile sites as an alternative? Maybe better early ground prep will help. Not sure who raised that. Thought I saw somebody's hand raised then, actually. Phil, do you want to just explain on that further, and then we'll come to Dave to discuss that?
Yeah, it just occurred to me, I was talking to somebody on a site visit yesterday, and he is an agronomist, and I'd sort of heard this on the grapevine, but he said it sounds very much like glyphosate. Roundup, to those that don't know what it is likely to be withdrawn in the next few years. Certainly it's the main chemical I'm aware that the contractors that I use and some of the volunteer groups use for spot weeding when you're tube planting, and individual guards basically in small, medium-sized woodlands. And I just wonder, if that happens, how do we deal with it? And what do we do as an alternative? Comments, please.
Dave?
Yep. Glyphosate, the rumours of glyphosate being banned or some other particular chemical being banned that float around from time to time. It is an important chemical in woodland establishment, and it would be a major loss. The other chemical is propazamide, used to be known as curb, and that's also useful. Generally for our establishment, we are using both. We're using cultivation and using herbicides. And certainly, in fact, our preferred method on relatively fertile soils is in reasonable rainfall areas is mounding followed by strip spraying with propazamide, because it gives gives a weed control well into the summer. And I'm of the view that we should use cultivation and herbicides appropriately, and in good time, right in year 1 and year 2, and hopefully after 2 years you've got things sorted. Trying to minimize weed control just means that you're fighting a rearguard action, planting more trees, carrying on weeding for 3, 4, 5 years time. So planning things and getting it right is important. But we may, if it does happen that we lose herbicides, then we do have to look at alternatives. And again, using ground preparation is useful. Again, maybe talking about the debate between mounding and plowing. One of the advantages of plowing is that it gives good weed control on fertile sites, far better than mounding. And maybe to illustrate the problems of using mounding, this year I've actually personally bought myself a quad bike and a mower to go down between the rows of mounds, because mounds actually you get a lot of weeds on a mound site, and it's very difficult to get good herbicide control with contractors. So you might, by perhaps using a less intensive cultivation method, you might be creating another problem. So you've got to think about it in the whole here. So you might solve one problem, it might be minimizing some issue, but you create another one. So you've got to think in the round. Yeah, be practical.
I'm going to come to Will Marshall in the chat next. Before I do that, can I just ask Claire whether I've missed any questions in Mentimeter? If you could just scroll around and move the mouse to illustrate any that I've missed. So Will Marshall wanted to add something on mulch practice.
Hi there. Yeah, no, so I advise on a lot of different size planting schemes and restock schemes from 1 hectare or half hectare up to several tens of hectares. And a lot of people are getting onto the mulching idea, in that you retain soil moisture and you keep the soil warm. But one thing that I always have to end up advising them is, because they always have a mate who's an arborist and they're going to give them free mulch, and I always have to advise that if you think of a tree that's usually felled by a tree surge, diseased by the Ganoderma or honey fungus, and I understand that a lot of the time the mulch actually acts as a vector, speeding up the transmission and growth of those funguses, which can actually sometimes lead to earlier tree failure in those kind of new restock and planting places. So I usually advise, I think Jenkinson's, I think they treat all their mulch with, I can't remember the temperature, but it should kill all funguses. So I usually advise that if you do want to mulch, and it is usually cost effective on your hectare schemes, and if it's a public area, I usually advise, because then you don't have to close the area off for spraying as well. So it's quite a good solution in those kind of areas. I just wanted to add that, because I end up having to say that to quite a lot of people, is don't use our mulch, go to a proper supplier who's treated it.
Okay, thanks ever so much, Will. There's 2 questions in Mentimeter left to answer. I'm going to skip over one, which is about which we'll cover in later sessions, which is about specific different types of mounding. And in the bottom right hand corner question, there was a question, Claire, about no dig, low dig methods. And we'll take that as our last question. The use of no or low dig methods of cultivation are gaining ground in agriculture for various reasons. Is there room for this approach in forestry? I'm not sure who raised that question, but I'll let Dave have a bash at it, and then the questioner is very welcome to come back in, and then we'll move to a close.
Well, absolutely. And no digging on the right sites is the right thing to do. A lot of broadleaf planting on green fields is no dig cultivation, and it's absolutely the right thing to do. But I can take people, for anybody we wanted, we could take you around many native woodlands established in upland sites with the right species, with alder and willow, which like wet ground, where there's been no cultivation. They're 15 years of age and they're barely getting out of the tube. Wet sites are cold sites. Wet sites are infertile sites. So yeah, by all means, no dig, no cultivation in the right place. But you've got even even for trees species which like wet ground, they don't let, you know, they come, you just imagine they've just come out of a nice nursery down in Shropshire, been tended in the perfect seed bed for 2 years, and you go and shove them on top of Shap Fells, and then they're not going to do very well. So yeah, appropriate cultivation when it's needed. Know your site, know your soils. That's the key thing.
Okay, does the questioner want to come back in on that?
Yes, it was me. It was just that I was looking at various aspects of the modules, for example, fertilization. And then we were talking about turning the topsoil over to reduce competition from weeds. And I think sometimes we're being contradictory. We're not recognizing the value which the soil profile offers in terms of available fertilization, the soil organisms, natural mycorrhizal, which are in there. So it's perhaps just we need to rethink some standard techniques. Are they still valid, and learn from agriculture as well?
So I think we'll leave that as the closing comment, really, which is we need to think, because I think we need to think about lots of this stuff, and you've all been thinking and engaging today, which is absolutely brilliant. Thank you. I'll just do a very, very brief summary. I really want to thank Dave. I think he's earned his wage today. So thanks ever so much, Dave, bringing that blend of experience, knowledge from various different backgrounds. I think that's really useful. I must absolutely big up the Cumbria Woodlands team, but especially Carrie, who has been beavering away for a long time to produce the modules. And I think the content is exceptional, and the whole look and feel of it is exceptional. I'm sure you'll all applaud that as we move through the other 4 modules as well. The next event next week is all about license to operate stuff, really, I think. So it's all about the environmental guidance and the legislation. We absolutely have to get that stuff right. If we don't get that stuff right, then it's likely to bring things to a shuddering halt in the world of forestry, and we will not achieve our potential. So absolutely vital session next week. The materials for that are up online now. My last comment really goes right back from the start to the start, which, as I said, look, we're trialing this approach to see how it's worked. We really do want to get a flavour of that. We're getting some good stuff back in there, but do feel free to get back to us by email, phone, etc. if you think we can tweak, change, amend, improve for next week. So thank you, Dave. Thank you, Carrie. Thanks to the Cumbria Woodlands team, and thanks to everybody for joining us. Look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you. If I could ask the Cumbria Woodlands team and Dave just to stay online just very briefly, that would be brilliant.